Night, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, August 1942. The jungle breathed in heavy silence, thick with humidity and the stench of rot. Rain dripped from the palms like slow tears. Somewhere in that blackness a man moved, barely. Corporal Robert Chandler of the 1st Marine Division lay prone, inching forward through the wet grass. He was 24, a scout trained to listen more than he spoke. Around him, the Pacific night was alive with unseen eyes. The air carried the low hum of insects, the hiss of wind against bamboo, and beneath it all, the sense that something watched him back. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears. One misstep, one snapped twig, and the jungle would erupt. The Japanese owned the night here. Their snipers and patrols moved like ghosts. Many Marines had vanished in the darkness, never found. Scouts like Chandler were sent to find what had taken them. He'd been crawling for an hour when he saw it, a faint red ember, pulsing softly in the dark. The unmistakable glow of a cigarette. For a moment he froze. The ember moved slightly, bobbing with a rhythm of breath. Someone was there, 50 yards ahead, maybe less. It was small human alive. A whisper from one of his earlier patrols echoed in his mind. The Japs can't give up the smoke even when death's 2 feet away. Chandler knew the risks. It could be bait. A single ember used to draw men in, but he also knew Japanese scouts often smoked at rest, confident in the jungle's cover. The ember blinked again, then dimmed. Chandler steadied his rifle, squinting through the foliage. He marked the position and gave 2 slow hand signals behind him. Silence. The rest of his 4-man patrol melted into shadow. The humid air thickened. Every leaf seemed to tremble. He crawled another foot forward, feeling mud seep into his sleeves. He was hunting someone who was hunting him. The ember flickered again, and that was enough. He memorized its position, slowly exhaled and whispered, "There." In that instant, Chandler understood the jungle's cruel logic. In the Pacific, the smallest light could be both salvation and death. And that faint glow would soon ignite something far larger than a cigarette. By mid-1942, the Pacific was burning. Japan's empire stretched from the Philippines to New Guinea, a steel tide that had drowned every Allied foothold it touched. Then came Guadalcanal, a name that would soon define survival itself. The island was little more than dense jungle and disease, but its location was everything. Whoever held it could control the sea routes between America and Australia. When U.S. Marines landed there in August 1942, they were not stepping onto a battlefield. They were entering a trap set by nature and man alike. The Japanese called it the Island of Death, and within weeks the Marines agreed. The jungle was a living enemy. Choking humidity, swarming insects, fever that struck harder than bullets. Every rustle could be a rifle. Every shadow a sniper. The war in Europe moved with tanks and cities. Here it moved in whispers. To fight in this green labyrinth, the Marines needed eyes, men who could move where others couldn't. Scouts and snipers were the difference between survival and slaughter. They mapped enemy positions, tracked patrols, and crawled for miles unseen. These were not large battles. They were duels of silence. One false breath could end a man. Reconnaissance patrols operated deep in no man's land, often outnumbered, always out of sight. Chandler was part of one such team. The 1st Marine Division had learned fast that the Japanese fought with a different rhythm. They attacked at night, slipping through the trees like phantoms. Their discipline was legendary. But even discipline had cracks. And one of those cracks was a habit they carried from home, the cigarette. On paper it seemed trivial, a moment of comfort in chaos. But in a jungle where light meant life or death, that glow was a betrayal. Scouts began to notice it, faint dots in the dark, flickering along trails or riverbanks. The Japanese soldiers' faith in the jungle's concealment blinded them to how far that ember could be seen. The Marines started to adapt, watching for the light rather than the man. By the time Chandler saw that single glow on the trail, the tactic had evolved from observation to opportunity. The cigarette was no longer just a habit. It was a signal, one that could turn predator into prey. Scouts like Chandler were ghosts among ghosts. Their world existed between patrol lines, in places maps refused to name. They carried little: rifle, knife, rations, and silence. Every step was a calculation between life and exposure. In the early months of Guadalcanal, their job was to move ahead of the main companies. feeling the pulse of the jungle before anyone else. The Japanese had perfected ambush. The Marines had to learn it the hard way. Chandler and men like him, often hunters, loggers, or farm boys before the war, adapted faster than anyone expected. They learned to crawl through mud for hours, to smell the difference between wet bamboo and human sweat. They could tell a Japanese footpath from an animal trail by the tilt of the grass. Each night, patrols stripped away more of what made them human. They slept in the dirt, woke to rain, and listened to the dying without flinching. They were not looking for glory. They were looking for signs, tracks, hushed voices, the faint glimmer of metal in the dark. Chandler's team, part of the Marine Raider reconnaissance element, had already lost 2 men in similar operations. The Japanese had uncanny patience. They would wait motionless for hours, rifles resting on branches, bayonets glinting like fangs. Sometimes they attacked without firing a shot, just knives in the dark. What haunted Chandler most was not the fighting, but the silence afterward. The jungle didn't echo like Europe's battlefields. It swallowed everything whole. Men disappeared without sound. When the Marines found what was left, it was often days later, bones half buried in the mud, rifles still clutched in white hands. Each mission blurred the line between hunter and hunted, and in that blur the cigarette glow took on new meaning. Some Marines mocked the superstition, smoke and you die. But scouts knew better. They'd seen how the faintest light betrayed a man's position long before a gun did. The enemy smoked because it calmed them, the same way Marines whispered prayers. In the stillness it became both weakness and comfort. Chandler had seen it once before. A small ember, a burst of gunfire, and then nothing. That memory was what steadied his hand now, as he stared at the faint glow in the distance. He understood he was no longer observing an enemy. He was about to trap one. The idea came not from a manual but from instinct, the kind that grows out of fear and repetition. Chandler had noticed it for weeks. Japanese scouts who smoked to steady their nerves, unaware that a cigarette's glow could be seen from hundreds of yards in the dark. The ember betrayed everything: distance, direction, even breathing rhythm. It was the one human weakness that technology hadn't yet learned to hide. One night, crouched under the dripping palms, Chandler turned that weakness into a weapon. He'd studied the enemy long enough to understand their confidence. The Japanese believed the jungle was their ally. They moved through it like spirits, assuming the Americans couldn't match their stealth. But the Marines were learning fast. In the damp silence, Chandler had the idea. If a cigarette glow could reveal a man, it could also summon one. The logic was brutal but sound. Show them what they expect to see, an American careless enough to smoke, and let them come. Then strike when the dark closes around them. That night he explained it to his small patrol in a whisper. 2 riflemen would position themselves in a crescent, hidden behind fallen palms. A third Marine, the youngest, was to crawl 10 yards ahead and plant a cigarette into a slit bamboo stalk. The ember would stay low to the ground, steady, lifelike. Then they'd wait. The plan depended on patience, hours of stillness, no movement, no sound. The jungle's rhythm would mask them. The Japanese, drawn by the glow, would creep toward it, believing they had found a careless Marine. When they did, the crescent would close in a single burst. Chandler's hand trembled slightly as he prepared his position, not from fear, but from the raw awareness of what was about to happen. He had seen the enemy's efficiency, how they struck first and vanished. Now he was turning their own instinct against them. The cigarette burned faintly in the damp air, its tiny glow pulsing like a heartbeat. 10 yards beyond it, Chandler lay prone, rifle steady, eyes unblinking. Somewhere in the distance, a twig snapped. Then another. The forest exhaled, as though it too was watching. Chandler's finger hovered over the trigger. The jungle was ready to test its own silence. Minutes became hours. The jungle around Chandler seemed frozen, every raindrop suspended mid-full. The faint red glow ahead pulsed softly, steady as breath. His rifle rested on a rotting log, sight fixed just above the ember's edge. Behind him, the 2 Marines waited in silence, invisible even to each other. This was the art of the scout, fighting not with bullets first, but with patience. He heard them before he saw them, soft footfalls, almost rhythmic. Then a quiet scrape, metal brushing bark. Japanese scouts moving in. Chandler could tell by the pattern. 3, maybe 4 men, spacing tight, advancing low. Their discipline was frightening. No words, no lights, just the faint rustle of movement circling the trap. The cigarette glow had done its job. Through the leaves he glimpsed a shadow slip forward, bare feet, rifle in hand, headcloth dark with moisture. The man paused, studying the ember. Another figure crouched beside him, then a third. They were whispering, pointing toward the faint red light. Chandler's world narrowed to the curve of his trigger and the sound of his own breath. He felt the tension build, not panic, but that sharp, focused quiet before violence breaks. The Japanese leader raised his hand, signaling the approach. They began to fan out, encircling the glow. Chandler watched one move directly in front of his sights, 20 yards out. The cigarette flickered once, then dimmed as a raindrop struck the ash. The shadow froze. Chandler's heartbeat slowed. He counted silently, 1, 2, 3, until he saw the leader lift his rifle. That was the signal. A flash of lightning tore the sky open, blinding for an instant. In that silver burst, Chandler saw every shape in motion. 4 enemy scouts closing in, eyes fixed on the cigarette. When the darkness returned, the jungle swallowed them again. But Chandler didn't need light anymore. He knew exactly where they were. He shifted the safety, feeling the cold click beneath his thumb. Around him the air held its breath. He waited for one more sound, one misstep, one whisper too close. Then the trap would spring. Somewhere in that blackness he heard a faint inhale, the last drawn breath before everything exploded. The rain had stopped. The air hung heavy, still as glass. Chandler lay motionless, every sense sharpened to a razor's edge. The faint ember still glowed in the wet stalk of bamboo, a single red eye staring into the void. He knew the Japanese scouts were no more than a few yards from it now. Their soft movement had ceased. They too were waiting. In the jungle, waiting was a weapon. Whoever broke the silence first usually died. The Japanese patrol leader shifted his position, lowering himself almost flat. Chandler could hear the faint creak of his rifle sling, the brush of fabric against wet fern. They were close, too close to retreat. His mind ran cold calculations, distance, angle, number of shots before they reached the cover. The other Marines waited for his signal, fingers already curled around their triggers. A few yards away, one of the Japanese soldiers slowly raised his Arisaka rifle, its bayonet glinting with the faint light. He leaned toward the glow, the movement deliberate, cautious. The ember danced slightly with the wind, alive, convincing. To him, it was an American foolish enough to smoke in the dark. To Chandler, it was a fuse waiting to ignite. The scout leader gave a soft bird-like chirp, a signal to strike. That was the sound Chandler needed. His hand tightened. He whispered a single word, now. 3 rifles opened at once. The jungle erupted in thunder. Muzzle flashes ripped through the blackness, painting the trees in bursts of white. The first Japanese soldier dropped instantly, the ember's glow reflecting off his falling helmet. 2 others fired blindly, their shots snapping branches and leaves. Chandler rolled sideways, firing again, his rifle kicking mud into his face. The Marines' overlapping fields of fire turned the clearing into chaos. It lasted less than 15 seconds. Then silence returned, swift, absolute. The smell of cordite mingled with rain and blood. The ember struck by a stray round had shattered into ash. Chandler's ears rang, but his breathing stayed slow. He scanned the shadows, rifle still raised. No movement. Only the faint hiss of rain returning to the leaves. He felt no victory, only release. The trap had worked. But in the stillness afterward, he understood the cost of playing death's game by its own rules. The jungle, indifferent, resumed its hum. And for the first time that night, Chandler wished he hadn't seen that cigarette at all. For a moment, nothing existed but the echo of gunfire dissolving into the trees. The jungle had devoured sound again, as if the fight had never happened. Steam rose from the wet earth, mingling with smoke from the rifles. Chandler's hands trembled slightly, the recoil still tingling through his bones. He adjusted his grip, steadying his breath. The acrid scent of cordite hung thick in the damp air. A faint groan broke the quiet. One of the Japanese scouts was still alive. Chandler motioned to his men, spreading his fingers to hold their fire. Through the faint moonlight filtering between the palms, he could see movement, slow, pained. The man was crawling, dragging himself toward the fallen rifle that lay beside the extinguished ember. His uniform was soaked dark with blood, but he refused to stop. Even wounded, the enemy's resolve was terrifying. Chandler aimed but hesitated. It wasn't mercy. It was something colder, an understanding. They were both scouts, men who lived on silence and instinct. The crawling soldier reached the cigarette, his hand trembling as he touched the mud-stained bamboo stalk. The ember was gone now, only ash. He stared at it for a second that felt endless, then collapsed face first into the dirt. The Marines advanced slowly, rifles sweeping. No more movement. 4 bodies lay scattered in the clearing, rifles half buried in the muck. The trap had worked with brutal precision. Chandler crouched beside one of them, studying the faces. Young, no older than he was. Their expressions were still, eyes open, staring upward through the dripping canopy. One had a half-burned cigarette case tucked into his breast pocket. Chandler closed it quietly and placed it beside him. Behind him, one Marine muttered, "They never saw it coming." Chandler didn't answer. He looked at the tiny patch of earth illuminated by the moon, where the glow had once pulsed. He felt the weight of what it had meant. That faint light so ordinary had drawn 4 men to their deaths. He exhaled slowly, almost in apology. "Neither did we," he whispered, though no one heard. The jungle rustled again, soft rain beginning to fall, washing the blood into the soil. To anyone passing by at dawn, it would look like nothing had happened, just another piece of the Pacific swallowing its secrets. But for Chandler, the darkness had changed forever. Dawn came slow on Guadalcanal. A thin grey light crept through the canopy, revealing the battlefield's quiet aftermath. Mist drifted above the ground like smoke from a fading fire. The rain had washed most of the signs away, blood diluted into the soil, footprints blurred into mud. To any passing patrol, the clearing would look untouched. But Chandler's team could still feel the violence lingering in the air. The jungle never forgot. They searched the bodies silently. It wasn't looting. It was procedure. Every scrap of paper, map, or insignia could mean something. Chandler found a small leather pouch inside one of the Japanese soldiers' tunics, a notebook, soaked and torn. The writing, smeared by rain, was still legible in places. He recognized a few English words: Sendai, rain, hungry. It wasn't a field report. It was a diary. The man had been writing about home, about the rain back in Miyagi Prefecture, about how the jungle never stopped breathing. Chandler folded it and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't know why. Maybe because it reminded him that the enemy bled the same way he did. When the squad regrouped, the mood was subdued. No cheers, no talk, just exhaustion. The young Marine who had planted the cigarette stared at the ground, shaking slightly. Chandler walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did fine," he said quietly. "It's over." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't. In the jungle, nothing was ever truly over. Back at the perimeter, the patrol reported their contact. The commanding officer nodded, expression blank, then marked a small red X on the map. One more encounter logged, one more nameless fight among thousands. No one asked how they'd done it. No one wanted to know. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, Chandler lay awake beneath his poncho, listening to the distant roll of thunder. He thought about the glow, the way it had pulsed, the way men had died chasing it. The tactic worked, but something in him recoiled at the memory. Using a man's comfort against him, turning habit into death. It felt like stepping too deep into the darkness. Yet in this war, that was survival. He closed his eyes and tried to forget, but the ember burned on behind his eyelids, bright and merciless, reminding him that silence always has a cost. For the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal, cigarettes were more than habit, they were solace. Tobacco had been part of the imperial soldiers' rations since the Russo-Japanese War. Packs of peace or golden bat were issued with rice and bullets. In the suffocating humidity of the Pacific, that brief ritual of lighting up after a march or battle was one of the few remnants of home. They smoked when waiting, when frightened, when alone. The ember's glow wasn't just nicotine, it was memory, comfort, connection. But on Guadalcanal, that comfort became lethal. Reports from surviving Japanese patrols described mysterious nighttime ambushes where men vanished in seconds. Some believed the Americans had supernatural detection equipment. Others whispered about ghosts of the jungle guiding enemy bullets. The truth was simpler and crueler. The glow of a single cigarette could betray an entire unit. Captured diaries and letters after the campaign painted a picture of confusion and disbelief. One infantryman from the 2nd Division wrote, We were careful, yet they always found us. I saw smoke in the darkness. I thought it was ours. Then the jungle exploded. The Americans' use of deception had become folklore among the Japanese ranks, something to be feared more than artillery. Officers began issuing strict orders: no lights, no fires, no cigarettes. Violators could be punished or beaten. Tobacco rations were restricted entirely during night operations. The jungle no longer hid them, it exposed them. Back in Tokyo, command analysts began reviewing reports from the island. They couldn't understand how such small patrols of Marines inflicted disproportionate losses. Their training had emphasized bold movement, infiltration, and sudden attack. But against the Americans' evolving night discipline, those strengths became weaknesses. In time, even the Japanese scouts learned to adapt, burying their cigarettes in the dirt to smoke unseen, or cupping both hands around the ember like a prisoner shielding a secret. Yet the psychological shift had already taken root. The jungle, once their ally, now felt like a mirror reflecting their every flaw. For Chandler's side, this transformation was invisible but profound. The enemy's fear of the dark had begun to match their own. The balance was tilting quietly, invisibly, one ember at a time. The lesson would ripple through the ranks of both armies, reshaping how men fought and how they hid from that night onward. By late 1942, the Marines on Guadalcanal had become creatures of the night. What began as desperation evolved into doctrine. The lessons carved from ambushes, cigarette traps, and sleepless patrols filtered through every unit. Light discipline became sacred. Not a match was struck, not a cigarette lit. Even the flicker from a wristwatch face was covered with tape. The jungle had taught its law: reveal nothing. The U.S. command adapted quickly. Night patrol training intensified. Recruits learned to march without light, to whisper in hand signals, to feel terrain rather than see it. Scouts were instructed to exploit sound, smell, and timing. Every sense became a weapon. Men learned how the rain masked movement, how wind direction carried voices, and how silence could be louder than gunfire. Chandler's small ambush on that unnamed trail had become an example whispered in briefings, a field-born tactic that spread across the island. Historians would later call it the birth of sensory warfare. It wasn't technology, it was adaptation. The human brain adjusting to survive an environment it was never meant to endure. The Japanese, once masters of stealth, found their advantage slipping. Marines began setting traps that mimicked human behavior: false coughs, faint lights, the smell of cooking fires, all bait. In response, Japanese patrols grew more cautious, often freezing for hours before advancing. The tempo of the jungle, war slowed into a deadly chess match, where every sound carried meaning. Chandler's platoon continued its reconnaissance missions. Each time they went out, they used the lessons of that night: discipline, deception, and the acceptance that mercy had no place in the undergrowth. They didn't call it heroism. They called it staying alive. Commanders took notice. Small unit tactics became the backbone of Marine jungle warfare, later formalized in manuals distributed throughout the Pacific theater. The Marines had learned to see without seeing, to move as part of the land. When asked later how they adapted, one officer summarized it simply: "We stopped fighting the jungle and started listening to it." Chandler understood that better than anyone. The cigarette trap had not only saved lives, it had forced a transformation. War was no longer about strength or numbers. It was about perception, patience, and the manipulation of fear. And on Guadalcanal, fear had finally begun to change sides. By the winter of 1942, Guadalcanal had become a graveyard of ambition. The island that once seemed like a forgotten speck on a map was now the focal point of a brutal test of endurance. Over 6 months of fighting had reduced it to mud, wreckage, and bones. Yet through the chaos the U.S. had held. Every ridge, every foxhole, every nameless trail had been paid for in blood. Chandler and his fellow scouts had watched the tide turn slowly, so slowly it was almost invisible. But the change was real. The Japanese had begun to falter. Supply lines stretched thin. Hunger gnawed harder than bullets. The once formidable imperial machine was starving in the jungle it once ruled. American control of the sea and air had strangled the island. At night, When Japanese barges tried to slip supplies ashore, they were met with tracers and torpedoes. By day, US aircraft hunted them mercilessly. Still, the Japanese fought with astonishing resolve, counterattacking through rain, disease, and hunger. They believed Guadalcanal was the key to halting America's momentum. In truth, it became the place where that momentum began. For the men on the ground, strategy meant little. They lived day to day, patrol to patrol between malaria bouts and shell fire. Chandler's unit had dwindled. Half sick, some evacuated, a few gone entirely. He had stopped marking time by dates. The war's rhythm was now measured by heartbeats, not calendars. Each mission felt heavier, not because of fear, but because of understanding. Every fight, every ambush was part of something vast and grinding that none of them could see. When word came in February 1943 that the Japanese had withdrawn, the relief was hollow. The Marines stood on captured ridges, staring at empty trails. No cheers, no celebration, just wind rustling through trees where thousands had died. Guadalcanal was won, but at a price too deep for victory parades. The US had proven it could stand toe-to-toe with Japan and win, but the men who made it happen knew the truth. This was only the beginning. Chandler cleaned his rifle one last time before boarding the transport ship. The cigarette trap, the endless nights, the faces in the dark. They all stayed behind on that island. As the ship pulled away, he looked back at the jungle fading into mist and thought of the men buried within it. The war was moving on, but part of him would never leave Guadalcanal. The scouts of Guadalcanal left the island with no medals, no headlines, and no songs. Their victories were measured in the men who came back alive and the ones who didn't. They existed between the lines of official reports. Enemy patrol neutralized. Contact established. No losses sustained. To most, those words meant nothing. To men like Chandler, they carried the weight of faces and names. Back at the new staging areas in New Caledonia and later Bougainville, the scout detachments were reformed, retrained, and sent again into the dark. They were the vanguard, never numerous, always necessary. They went ahead of the main force, unseen, uncelebrated. Their knowledge of the jungle, born of nights like the one with the cigarette trap, became the foundation for every future mission. Officers came and went. The scouts stayed, nameless but indispensable. They lived in the shadow of exhaustion. Malaria, jungle rot, dysentery, diseases that killed more surely than bullets. Many didn't survive long enough to see the war's end. Chandler himself was hospitalized twice, once for fever so high he couldn't remember his own rank. But what haunted him most were the quiet hours before dawn, when the jungle sounds returned in his dreams. He'd wake drenched in sweat, convinced he still saw the glow of that cigarette pulsing in the dark. The Marine Corps rarely spoke of the scouts. They weren't part of grand offensives or hero speeches. Their stories lived in whispers, passed between veterans who knew what it meant to crawl through the mud, alone hearing the enemy breathe just beyond the leaves. These men didn't ask for recognition, they only wanted to forget. But history, as it often does, forgot them anyway. Still, their influence remained. The methods they developed, stealth, counter-ambush, deception, became the backbone of jungle warfare across the Pacific. Later, in the Philippines, Palaleo, and Okinawa, Marines used the same principles Chandler had tested in the darkness. The cigarette trap became legend, a small, brutal fragment of a much larger lesson. For Chandler and others like him, there was no triumph in it, only memory. They had learned that survival demanded something colder than courage, the ability to think like the enemy, to use humanity itself as bait. They were the quiet architects of victory, men who fought in silence so others could march in daylight, and for that, they would forever remain unseen. By 1944, the lessons of Guadalcanal had spread across the Pacific like wildfire. What began as instinct, lighting a cigarette in the dark to draw an enemy in, had evolved into a full science of night warfare. The US Marine Corps and Army Rangers began formalizing what the scouts had done by intuition, deception through sensory control. It wasn't about firepower. It was about shaping perception, using the darkness as both ally and weapon. On Bougainville, scouts used small flickering lights to lure Japanese snipers into false cover zones. In New Guinea, units deployed decoy campfires made from phosphorus-soaked cloth to mislead enemy mortars. What Chandler had improvised with a cigarette became refined into strategy, light manipulation, sound mapping, and environmental illusion. The jungle had forced the evolution of modern camouflage and stealth. Meanwhile, technology caught up to instinct. Portable radar, infrared scopes, and directional microphones appeared in the final years of the war, turning the night into a contested domain. But beneath the machines, the principle remained human. The understanding that in darkness, fear itself could be weaponized. The scout's patience, his silence, his control of light, all became templates for future soldiers. After Guadalcanal, Chandler's unit was reassigned to the Philippines campaign. He noticed how the newer recruits carried themselves differently. They had been trained for darkness from the start. Every movement deliberate, every sound rehearsed. What he and his men had learned through pain and luck was now taught by design. Yet for all the progress, something was lost. The new generation fought the jungle with confidence, but not with respect. They didn't remember the nights when every heartbeat might be the last sound they'd hear. Years later, as infrared and night vision became standard issue, the cigarette trap faded into myth. An old Marine tale told to young recruits about the glow that killed a platoon, but its legacy endured. It was proof that innovation in war doesn't always come from laboratories or generals. Sometimes it comes from a man lying in the mud, terrified, who sees a flicker in the dark and decides to act. The transformation was complete. From a single ember in a jungle clearing to the invisible networks that would guide soldiers through the dark for decades. The light that once betrayed men had become the key to seeing beyond fear itself. The war ended, but for men like Bobby Chandler, it never really stopped. When the guns fell silent in 1945, he returned home to a country that had changed as much as he had. The Pacific was now a memory of mud and ghosts. Guadalcanal, the place where he had learned the language of darkness, was just another name in the history books. Yet every now and then, when night fell quiet and the world went still, he swore he could see it again, the faint pulse of a cigarette ember floating in blackness. He worked as a machinist after the war, raising a family, living quietly. Few knew what he'd done, fewer still asked. When neighbors spoke of bravery, he only smiled because he understood bravery was never loud. It was the act of staying still when every instinct screamed to run. The scout's courage was made of silence, not shouts. He kept his medals in a drawer, and his memories locked deeper still. Years later, when historians interviewed Guadalcanal veterans, they often spoke of the heat, the malaria, the fear. But the scout's stories, those who crawled ahead into nothing, were always whispered, as though even memory feared making noise. One Marine remembered Chandler's trap. We learned that night that light and life were the same thing out there. Lose one, you lose the other. Guadalcanal became the symbol of the turning tide, the place where the Pacific War began to shift. But its truest lessons were personal, buried in the minds of men who survived its jungles. They understood that war wasn't just about courage or strategy, it was about adaptation. It was about watching, waiting, and knowing when to let darkness speak for you. On his porch years later, Chandler once struck a match, watched its flame dance, then blew it out before it could burn too long. The faint smoke curled upward and vanished. He stared at the fading glow for a long moment, remembering the jungle's heavy air, the silence, the faces he could never forget. History would remember the battles, the ships, the generals. But the truth of war often lies in moments no one saw, like the quiet flash of a cigarette in the night, and the man who used it to change the course of a fight. The last glow died in the wind, leaving only darkness. And in that darkness, a lesson endured. Even the smallest light can decide who lives to see the dawn.